It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Guy Sorman. Mr. Sorman is a French political economist, author, and intellectual. He has taught since 1970 at various universities in Paris, Beijing, Seoul, and Stanford here in the States. There's still seats up front. He is a city official in his hometown of Bologna near Paris, and he's been an advisor to 2 former French presidents and the president of South Korea. He has been chairman of Action Against Hunger and a member of the French Human Rights Commission. He has published more than 25 books, most of them translated into English, and one is very relevant to our event tonight, entitled The Empire of Lies, The Truth About China, written in 2005-2006, when he spent a year in the forest provinces in China. At that time, he met and became friends with the human rights activist Liu Xia and his wife, the artist Liu Xia. Mr. Sorman was the first to write about her work, and just before she was placed under house arrest, he convinced her to share the photographs with the world. And we're indebted for that action. Please join me in welcoming Guy Sorman.
Thank you, Professor Waller, and thank you not to have called me Guy Sorman, but Guy Sorman, which is my French name. How should I start? Well, it's 8 o'clock in the morning in Beijing right now, and Liu Xia doesn't know that we are here to talk about her work, and she doesn't know that we are to open the exhibition of her work. She doesn't know because since more than 2 years, she has been deprived of not only of freedom, but deprived of any way of communicating with the rest of the world. She has no telephone, no computer, no internet connection, and she's alone from time to time, but she never knows when in advance to meet her older mother and go with her for some shopping, and this is it. We are able to keep some kind of communication with her, but it's extremely complicated. We have to inform the mother, but we don't know when the mother will meet Liu Xia, and also the mother wants to protect her daughter. So the mother has decided, and we can understand that, not to give too many informations to Liu Xia, so that when Liu Xia is interrogated by the police, she can honestly deny that she doesn't know about the exhibitions of her work. So she has, since December 28, when some dissidents were able to reach her in her apartment, what we see in the video, she has a general notion that the work that she trusted me with more than 2 years ago is exhibited somewhere around the world. She doesn't know more than that. She has never seen, to my knowledge, never read the reviews of her work. She has never seen or never had in her hand a catalog on her work. So it's a person who has kind of 2 lives in a way. There is one life as a prisoner and one life as an artist touring the world. And these 2 persons have no relation between themselves. And when we say she's under house arrest, I think this looks very mild. The truth is that to be under house arrest in China is worse than to be in jail. Liu Xia, after being indicted, and he condemned for 11 years in jail. He's in jail, but he has some rights. He can watch television, he has a telephone, he can, receive visitors. Liu Xia is in a black hole. She's in the hands of the police, and she basically has no rights. And the French government and also the US government intervened so that she should be sent to jail. And the Chinese government said it's not possible because she committed no crime. So we cannot send her to jail. And so this is quite a typical situation for a Chinese dissident. And now let's go back to the very beginning of this history or story. As Richard mentioned, I met Liu Xia in Liu Xia in 2005, and we became friends. And I discovered these photos by accident because she's an artist, but she never wanted to show her work because she always considered that the important person in the couple was Liu Xiaobo. And that if she would show her work as an artist, maybe it would introduce some confusion. And so her work was basically hidden. And so the first step for me was to convince her to show these photos to the world. It took me some years. And eventually she was convinced a little bit more than 2 years ago, because she knew that the husband was already in jail, and that probably she would be arrested. And that was the reason why she eventually gave me these photos. And these photos, I won't comment on them because some art critics here are in a better position to do that, but just some very general remarks on these photos. And they are photos which belong to what I call prisoner's art. I mean, it reminds me of the kind of art, writing, photos, paintings, which have been made in the contemporary history by people in jail, like people in the Gulag in the Soviet Union, with very limited technical resources, able to express what their feeling was, and what it is to be completely deprived of your freedom. And so I won't comment on the photos. There is a question which is very often asked, including by the journalist in Richmond: how did the photo get out of China? And I say to the journalist that this is the only question I cannot answer to, because this would put into danger some of the people who were very helpful to have these photos out of China. But I do insist that not only Liu Xia never broke any Chinese law, but also I never broke any Chinese law, because she has never been indicted, and so it was a bit complicated to get the photos out of China, but I didn't break any law. And every time, I don't know if it will be the case in Richmond, but every time I show this exhibit, usually the organizers received a letter from the Chinese embassy saying, how dare you show the work of what, of whom? And the first time the exhibition was shown in my city of Boulogne-Billancourt, of course I chose my city because I'm deputy mayor for culture there, the Chinese ambassador asked to meet the French Minister of Foreign Affairs and to protest and say, how dare you, and he somehow is a public official, how dare he, and also President Sarkozy sent his wife to attend the inauguration of the exhibition, how dare you do that, it's an insult to China. And the answer from the minister and my answer is that we are not insulting China. On the contrary, we are introducing to the world a remarkable artist, which shows that there is in China right now, in spite of all the repression, there is a cultural renaissance. And so we want, as non-Chinese, be part of this cultural renaissance, because I think we become more wealthy because we have more art, at our disposal. And it's too bad that the Chinese government doesn't do its job to promote Chinese artists. So because the Chinese government doesn't do it, well, we do it in its name. And I'm very sincere. A bit ironical, of course, but I'm also very sincere. In China today, and it was in the case also in the Soviet Union, in the very last years of the regime, the artists are the people who express the most, the inner heart, the inner soul of the people, and what their aspirations are. So not only this is not an anti-China exhibition, it's a deeply pro-China, but of course pro-Chinese people exhibition. And I'm doing this, and like many here, because we love China. We love the Chinese people. And we are just a bit fed up to see media coverage devoted to the economic success of China, to wealthy people, and to business relations. There is another China, which I would say the true China, kind of a revival of a great civilization. And this is what we glorify tonight, a great artist and a great civilization. And I do hope that someday, I'm sure someday, Liu Xia will be with us. And as you said, I'm a writer, so I have some imagination. So I think that maybe right now Liu Xia is with us. Thank you very much.
It is my great pleasure to introduce A.D. Coleman, the renowned photography critic and historian, co-curator of the exhibition, and tonight's keynote speaker. Alan D. Coleman has published 8 books and more than 2,000 essays on photography and related subjects. Formerly a columnist for the Village Voice, the New York Times, and the New York Observer, Mr. Coleman has contributed to Art News, Art on Paper, Technology Review, Juliet Art Magazine in Italy, European Photography in Germany, La Fotografia in Spain, and Art Today in China. His work has been translated in 21 languages and published in 31 countries. In 2002, he received the Cultural Prize of the German Photographic Society, the first critic of photography to be so honored. In 2010, he received the J. Dudley Johnston Award from Britain's Royal Photographic Society for sustained excellence in writing about photography. His widely read blog, Photocritic International, appears at photocritic.com. Since 2005, exhibitions he has curated have opened in Canada, China, Finland, Hong Kong, Italy, Romania, Spain, Taiwan, and here in the United States, and now including our exhibition opening tonight in Richmond. The title of his lecture this evening is Freedom Reflex, the Photographs of Liu Xia. Please join me in welcoming A.D. Coleman.
Richard, and thank you all for coming out tonight. Can you hear me in the back? Good. I want to second all of the thanks that were given before to the people who have been involved in this show in Richmond, and I want to add just a couple of my own. I want to thank my wife, Anna Lung, for supporting my decision to facilitate the tour of this exhibition and for serving as my interpreter in Hong Kong and Beijing as we acted on that commitment last summer. Anne is in Shenzhen, China right now, otherwise she'd be here with me tonight. I want to give a tip of my hat to my diligent webmaster, John Alley of Richmond, who is here with us tonight. I want to thank Brent Baldwin, who wrote a really first-rate feature article for Style Weekly introducing the show to the Richmond audience, which I'm sure is what brought a number of you here to be with us this evening. And finally, because he can't say it himself, I especially want to thank the unflappable Richard Waller, director of the University of Richmond Museums, whose determination to make this show happen here survived more unpredictable twists and turns than usual in scheduling the preparation and staging of a touring exhibition. So can I ask you to give them all a round of applause? The Tang Dynasty poet Wang, sometime around 8000 AD, wrote a lyric in the patient voice of a wife stoically contemplating her husband's long absence. Roughly translated, it bears the title Stone of Love and goes as follows. On this hilltop I wait for you, the river below quietly flowing. Never moving or looking homeward, standing here still, I become a stone. Days and nights pass, rain and snow, till you return, so I can speak again. Liu Xia's photographs speak volumes. To make them, she employs the simplest of means, an old Russian model twin-lens reflex camera and black and white roll film she can process herself. Generic analog photography tools, materials, and processes that haven't changed radically in over a century. Through this camera's lens, she addresses subject matter no less elementary. A cluster of small dolls from Brazil, gifts from a friend that she calls the ugly babies, juxtaposed with each other and simple props, a bird cage, a heap of cigarette butts, tea candles, scraps of cloth, stacks of books, a jar, some flowers, and then configured on a table, a bookshelf, a chair, a couch, a mirror. She registers these scenarios in her negatives with no special effects, save for occasional double exposures, using only available light. She develops and prints the results in her home darkroom. And if you saw the video before, if you go to look it up on YouTube, recent videos of her taken in her apartment illicitly without authorization, you'll see many of these photographs pinned to the wall of her apartment, of their apartment in Beijing. So these images are very much part of her daily life. On rare occasions, Liu Xia takes her dolls outdoors to the beach or Tiananmen Square in one case, or what looks like a barn or a cowshed to direct their performances in other settings. In a few cases, one of them interacts visibly with a human being, boldly confronting some oversized fingers, or perching like a parasitic twin on the shoulder of a man who resembles strikingly her husband, the writer and activist Liu Xia. Another suffers the crushing squeeze of a giant hand. Sometimes she dispenses with the dolls entirely, draping her fingers with dark cloth to turn the visible tips thereof into featureless faces atop oddly feminine shrouded figures, mourning and bearing witness. Or she merely knots and configures a dark silk scarf into dimensional forms to examine or scrutinizes some slowly decaying vegetables. We might consider this a form of child's play, albeit freighted with all the gravity and emotional identification that children bring to such games. Taken out of context, considered simply as another body of work presented to the international image community, it's hard to imagine anyone finding these images, or their patently introverted maker, dangerous. Yet Liu Xia, though never charged with any crime, has lived under house arrest in their Beijing apartment since January 2011. This extralegal incarceration following the October 2010 announcement in Stockholm that Liu Xia, already imprisoned on trumped-up charges, had received the 2010 Nobel Peace Prize. Only her mother has permission to visit her on occasion, as Sorman pointed out, And these pictures, extracted under the government radar by Yi, cannot be exhibited or published in the People's Republic, even though, like Liu Xia, they have broken no laws. Thus, we must consider these nominally mute images and their unassuming, reticent creator as somehow quite vocal and deeply threatening to what the Chinese Communist Party likes to refer to as social harmony, by which they mean their own unchallenged grasp on power and control over their 1.4 billion subjects. Statistically, of course, Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo have no significance as members of a population that size. Yet the totalitarian mind cannot allow exception, permitting even a single citizen to adopt a shape other than that of the mold that Mao Zedong notoriously devised for his people, threatens the hegemony of that matrix. The modern totalitarian state does not afford anyone the luxury of such divergence. Propaganda cannot be satisfied with partial successes, for it does not tolerate discussion, as Jacques Ellul wrote half a century ago. By its very nature, it excludes contradiction and discussion. Some would argue that the new China, with its capitalism-friendly economic policies, power-hungry princelings and princesses, flamboyant billionaires, and rampant governmental corruption, has moved away from its totalitarian past. But even if so, the Tiananmen massacre is little more than 2 decades past, still fresh in the memories of many. Meanwhile, a new generation has emerged whose access to information and communication via social media make Procrustean Mao-style molding all but impossible, a fact that the old guard in the current regime, with their limited grasp of these technological and sociological shifts, fail to comprehend, yet find profoundly unnerving. As Jacques Ellul argued presciently half a century ago, electronic technologies make other and subtler kinds of social control eminently feasible. Yet even were China's rulers technologically savvy enough to use the new media to their full advantage, they would still face the problem of the occasional, intractable exception. The Russian scientist I.P. Pavlov wrote thus about one of the otherwise domesticated dogs he tested in his laboratory. "We started off with a very simple experiment," Pavlov wrote. "The dog was placed in a stand. It stood quietly enough at first, but as time went on, it became excited and struggled to get out of the stand, scratching at the floor, gnawing the supports, and so on. For a long time, we remained puzzled over the unusual behavior of this animal, until it occurred to us at last that it might be the expression of a special freedom reflex, and that the dog simply could not remain quiet when it was constrained in the stand." Now, Pavlovian science stands mostly refuted and discredited today, yet its premises underpinned the indoctrination techniques of the totalitarian states of the 20th century, not just the USSR, but Nazi Germany and the People's Republic of China, among others. And in an ostensibly benign form, it entered the infrastructure of behaviorist psychology to become a central component of all subsequent motivational research, including marketing and propaganda studies. Apparently, it comforted Pavlov and his colleagues to cast this dog's refusal to submit and conform as merely another previously unidentified reflex, the freedom reflex, no different in kind from the salivating at the mere sound of a bell that they conditioned in more obedient dogs. Though they had already made propagandizing their subjects an official policy, the first state ever to do so, the Soviets had not yet refined it. Pavlov thus could afford his bemusement at this exception to the rule, tolerating it by bringing it into the fold via nomenclature. Mao and those who served him learned that Pavlov's freedom reflex is contagious and must be contained, if not expunged. Easier to achieve that in Mao's time than in ours. Since Tiananmen, the strategy of his successors has been to substitute gradually the seductions of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World for the repressions of George Orwell's 1984. People in China today feel free to express their political opinions to each other without fear of the thought police swooping down on them, so long as they do so privately, not publicly, and certainly not on the record, not in print, not on the radio or television, not on the internet, in either words or images. And most of them seem willing to accept those restrictions now that they can choose to eat McDonald's hamburgers, drink Pepsi-Cola, and accessorize with iPhones. But not all. That problematic freedom reflex just keeps cropping up. It manifests itself in straightforward acts of citizenship, such as Liu Xia's co-authoring of Charter 08, a call for the democratization of China. It takes the form of Liu Xia speaking out on his behalf, marrying him in prison, enduring like a rock until he's released. And it embeds itself in these photographs made by Liu Xia between 1996 and 1999, while Liu Xiaobo was serving his second jail sentence and shortly after his release. A bit of context here. From the Russian Revolution on, the various regimes in the former Soviet Union identified photography as central to revolutionary practice and promoted it as the medium of the people, actively encouraging photography as a hobby, endorsing and supporting a formal and informal network of camera clubs and other spaces where people could develop their own photographs. Neither dynastic China nor the PRC during its first decades enabled so widespread an amateur use of photography. And certainly communist China, partly for economic reasons, did not make film and cameras and darkroom equipment and film processing available at bargain rates to the population at large, as did the former Soviet Union. China's internal political struggles in the first third of the 20th century, followed by the war with Japan, concentrated almost all photographic activity on the modes of documentary, photojournalism, and press photography, in the service of various causes. That condition intensified once the CCP came to power in 1949. The photography of the time, most of it either photojournalistic or propagandistic or both in many cases, was closely censored and consciously avoided any evidence of individual stylistic choice or personal concerns. Indeed, recognizable style, a personalized way of seeing, and anything resembling self-expression became anathematized in all media, subsumed under the conformist doctrinaire demands of the theory and practice of so-called social realism. Photography manifesting any independence of thought or motive or noticeable Western influence was not only unpublishable, it was punishable. In the context of a citizenry trained to spy on its members and report any deviation, such work became unthinkable. Consequently, the tendencies that encompass what we in the West think of as creative photography, broadly defined, has a much shorter history in China than it does beyond that nation's borders. Perhaps 30 years worth all told, starting virtually from scratch in the early 1990s. This alone makes it difficult to position Liu Xia's work in relation to the production of other Chinese photographers and photo-based artists, past and present. The absence of anything resembling a robust critical dialogue conducted by independent critics of art and photography compounds that problem. Nor are there any histories of photography in China, not even histories of photography in Chinese, much less translated into English, to help us situate her project. So we have little to go on except for the work itself. Liu Xia wrote to a supporter in the United States, "You may find the dolls in my photos have lives, and the silk in my photos has soul." Dolls, mannequins, masks, and other simulacra of the human form have proven useful to photographers ever since the Surrealist movement began a century ago, making their appearance in works by Man Ray and Hans Fellner and many others. They continued that service through the late modernist photography of figures like Ralph Eugene Meatyard and Richard Kirstel, and then into the postmodern photography and photo-based art of Rory Simmons, David Leventhal, Andres Serrano, and many others. Similarly, photographers have long found diverse ways of rendering inanimate objects as energized and inorganic substances as alive. Chinese photography has no extended tradition of the symbolic still life. If Liu Xia's theatricalized dolls hark back to any authentically Chinese photographic antecedents, it would be to Zhang Yaxin's elaborately staged, melodramatic, hyper-real color photographs of the 8 model operas developed by Zhang Qing in the first 3 years of the Cultural Revolution. Those seem an unlikely reference point for this project of Liu Xia's, yet her familiarity with Western predecessors remains uncertain. Regardless of the extent to which Liu Xia has absorbed the history and tradition of world photography, her work with the medium connects her to practitioners around the world, past and present. But their photohistorical lineage hardly jeopardizes China's status quo or justifies her captivity. Nor does their literal subject matter, dolls, silk scarves, vegetables, commonplace household furnishings, and objects. What troubles the waters is their content. For these dolls have much to say, and at least one of them, which I take as a surrogate for Liu Xiaobo, just won't shut up. Some force, infrequently visible, always much larger than them, puts these homunculi to an endless series of ordeals. Ties them up, cocoons them in plastic, sticks them behind bars, seals them in jars, stuffs them into a birdcage, sets them adrift in the dark, subjects them to an unilluminated harangue, squashes them brutally in a fist. Yet, in the next image, they're back. In addition to the male doll already mentioned, 2 female dolls recur. One of them apparently perplexed by the bizarre goings-on, the other really angry about it all. I read them as aspects of Liu Xia herself. If the frequent presence of books symbolizes the life of the mind, then the silk sculptures function as metaphors of the life of the spirit, the calm center, the combination of softness and strength needed for psychic survival. The cowled fingertips serve as a Greek chorus, looking on. In short, a whole drama plays itself out in these images, a narrative of survival under extreme duress and stubborn persistence in bearing witness and speaking truth to power. Thoughtfully crafted, they convey their layered messages with persuasive acuity and uncompromising directness. These pictures tell their story to anyone visually literate from any culture. Their power is inherent, their messages clear, yet there is nothing specific in them to which the Chinese government could object. Nothing, let's say, that would legitimize the authorities rounding up 1,000 people who decided on a given day to don T-shirts bearing these images and wear them around Beijing or Shenzhen or Chengdu or Richmond for that matter. What else explains why Liu Xia lives under house arrest in Beijing and why these simple black and white photographs of dolls cannot be shown in mainland China? They constitute acts of resistance, visible and on the record as such once she gave her permission for their public display. They also open a conversation about the situation and rights of the individual citizen in relation to his or her government, a dialogue whose commencement the Chinese Communist Party cannot afford, because, as Jacques Ellul wrote, propaganda ceases where simple dialogue begins. Through the dispersion of these image spores of Liu Xia's, that freedom reflex can propagate. They invite the viewer to breathe them in deeply, then exhale. Let me finish with a few words about my involvement with this project and the results thereof. When you elect to live and work as a public intellectual, you build a platform for yourself in the agora, that metaphorical marketplace of ideas in which concepts contend energetically and truth, like cream, eventually rises to the top, or so we like to believe. At that same moment, you also step into an arena in which ideas struggle with each other, often violently and even brutally, for dominance. That those contests take place mostly with words and images rather than swords and spears does not make them less fraught with danger or less consequential than a confrontation between gladiators on the Roman sands. People have paid for their words with their lives. This audience surely needs no list of names to verify that fact. In my professional role as a working critic and cultural journalist, I have reported and editorialized for over 4 decades on behalf of photographers embroiled in censorship disputes, sometimes offering expert testimony in relevant court cases. In those ways, I've stood behind photographers and their right to freedom of vision. As a longtime member of PEN American Center, the U.S. branch of the Writers' Organization, and one who has served in the past on its Freedom to Write Committee in New York, I have supported my fellow writers everywhere in their struggles for freedom of thought and expression, their battles against censorship. In those ways, via donations, letters to various authorities, service and professional organizations, I've supported Liu Xia and other writers over the years. But my involvement in this project is different. I got into this entirely by accident, though it begins to feel like karma to me. In my professional life, I work as a critic, historian, and curator of photography. In those roles, I've traveled to China on numerous occasions since mid-2005. Knowing that, my oldest friend, Liu Xia, with whom I played in the sandbox in my infancy, introduced me in New York last February to Sorman, the French economist and social commentator who had extracted a set of prints of these images by Liu Xia from mainland China after his 2007 book, The Empire of Lies, persuaded him that she could trust him, and who had initiated this touring show. He needed someone who knew more about the world of photography and traveling exhibitions than he did to carry the project forward. Having spent a late winter morning admiring the images and some hours talking with Guy, I couldn't think of anyone more qualified than myself to perform those tasks. My wife, Anna Lung, my partner in all my professional projects involving Chinese photography, encouraged me to take it on, so I volunteered. It didn't feel as if I had much choice, nor did I want one. So I thank Guy Sorman for making me an offer I couldn't refuse. My participation in this venture differed fundamentally from anything I'd done previously as a curator. In all those situations, I winnowed down from much larger oeuvres to those examples that I considered central, illuminating, and synergistic. I dealt directly with the picture makers themselves, so the curatorial process became dialogic and interactive, with the final curatorial choices, including the physical forms of the work's presentations, understood and agreed on by all parties. I could thus feel confident that even if my selections and my structuring of the shows sometimes surprised their makers, the end results had their full approval. The works we had for the show and catalog, 26 prints plus an additional 14 images in the form of digital files, come from a much larger body of Liu Xia's photographic production, to which neither Sorman nor I have had access. Nor can we ask the artist herself for answers to our questions, as she's held incommunicado in her apartment. There's no accompanying artist statement, no published interviews about her work in photography, no critical dialogue from the mainland art photo press contextualizing the work. From a curatorial standpoint, they're messages in bottles that have washed up on our shores. And aside from what I'm saying here tonight and what he has told you, neither I nor he can tell you anything more about them. With that said, this work of Liu Xia's deserves the international audience it's reaching because, first and foremost, it's provocative, potent, evocative imagery. It demonstrates that 21st century China produces world-class visual artists whose work communicates across the boundaries of language and culture. Though its specific messages may not have the approval of the current hierarchy on the mainland, by employing photography, often considered the most democratic of all creative media, by restricting herself to basic techniques, and by using the most mundane subject matter, Liu Xia makes photographs so passionately engaging and readily accessible to the average citizen that critical exegesis becomes superfluous. They manifest in creative action the aspiration of which China's then Premier Wen Jiabao spoke to CNN in October 2010. And I quote him here, "I believe freedom of speech is indispensable for any country. Freedom of speech has been incorporated into the Chinese Constitution. The people's wishes for and needs for democracy and freedom are irresistible." End quote. By the way, this is what you're seeing on the screen now is my little rogues gallery of the uniformed and plainclothes thugs who keep Liu Xia in her apartment and restrict access to her. I've been gathering these over the internet, from the internet over the past year. This exhibition premiered in the fall of 2011 in Boulogne-Billancourt, just outside of Paris. From there, it went to New York, next to Hong Kong and Taipei, after that to Berlin, thence to Madrid, and now to Richmond, Virginia, and hereafter to points still to be determined. Most of the venues, including this one, have produced printed catalogs with essays by numerous authors, leaving a permanent trace of the show's travels and the response thereto. Additionally, and not surprisingly, the silent strength of Liu Xia has generated considerable and overwhelmingly favorable press response, both in print and online, adding to its impact. When she is freed from her captivity, and I say when, not if, Liu Xia will discover that at least this chunk of her work has already established a substantial track record for itself outside the PRC. You can view and download most of that material, including the various catalogs in PDF form, at the website we've developed for the project, liuxiaphotos.info, where you can also track the show's itinerary, find the latest news about her, and learn about the evolution of any corollary projects. This site, the most extensive online source of information about Liu Xia in English, will remain online indefinitely. My participation in this effort, and that of my wife Anna, began in New York almost exactly a year ago. Aside from maintaining the website, a long-term commitment of ours, that involvement concludes with tonight's events, not by our choice, but by the decision of Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo. Nonetheless, on behalf of Anna and myself, I want to thank both of them for the opportunity to engage with this imagery and with the crucial images embedded in it. We hope that this tour continues at least until Liu Xia is freed from house arrest and can determine the show's subsequent trajectory herself. We look forward to attending someday the conclusion of this exhibition's world tour at a venue in Beijing with Liu Xia herself and Liu Xiaobo present. Meanwhile, through these remarkable images, they are both here with us in spirit tonight, and we're honored to have this small role to play in this celebration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. At this point, we're going to have the four panelists come to the front. That's right. Yeah, unless you want to say. Thought we'd get the panelists in front of you, and of course you've heard me and Alan speak. I will briefly introduce our two panelists, Ambassador Randolph Bell and Associate Dean Vincent Wang. And then that they will give their remarks, and then we'll open up the discussion to the audience. Retired Ambassador Bell is currently president of the First Freedom Center here in Richmond. His distinguished career in the Foreign Services began in 1972, and his impressive list of achievements includes significant overseas embassy assignments, serving as acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for NATO and bilateral affairs, and as Ambassador Special Envoy for Holocaust issues. He is on the board of First Freedom Center, the Virginia Holocaust Museum, and the World Affairs Council of Greater Richmond. Dr. Vincent Wang is Professor of Political Science and Associate Dean in the School of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Richmond. A scholar on Asian politics and international relations, he has published more than 70 scholarly articles and book chapters on Asian political economy, security and international relations, East Asian and Latin American comparative development, and foreign policy and domestic politics for both Taiwan and China. He is currently president of the American Association for Chinese Studies. We'll start with Ambassador Bell and then followed by Dr. Wang.
Thank you. Two little bits about my gigs in the State Department that may be relevant this evening. My wife and I spent 6 years of our career assigned in Prague during the days of the Husak regime after the Soviet invasion. And that experience of life in a democratic centralist, Marxist-Leninist authoritarian state is relevant, I think, to what I'm going to be saying this evening. Secondly, I also spent a lot of time working on running the office that did intelligence on the former Soviet world and the Warsaw Pact, the dissolving Warsaw Pact at the time of change in Eastern Europe. I want to thank you all for coming this evening. The First Freedom Center is proud to be, along with the University of Richmond and VCU Arts, one of the three sponsors of this evening's program and of the photographic exhibition. The financial support we are providing for this endeavor is in realization of our mission to advance the fundamental human rights of freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. And just by way of explanation, we espouse all universal human rights. And the connectivity this evening, among other things, is that Liu Xia, and especially Liu Xiaobo, care very much about those human rights, and especially also freedom of religion and conscience. Liu Xiaobo spent a great deal of time studying the life of Jesus Christ and other figures engaged in nonviolent resistance and has cared very much about religious freedom. I want to take a few minutes to focus our attention on the profound challenges which authoritarian states like China pose, not only for universal human rights generally, but especially for internationally recognized rights which we at the First Freedom Center espouse. Let us recall, as has been explained this evening, that Liu Xiaobo was among the foremost authors and originators of Charter 08, which sought to provide a blueprint for bringing China into the realm of rule of law. And that document, in turn, was consciously based in part upon an earlier achievement, Charter 77, a human rights manifesto put together by advocates of human rights, democracy, the free arts, and free culture in Husak-era Czechoslovakia. Let us look briefly then to begin at the current state of religious freedom in China. In Charter 08, Liu Xiaobo and his friends were careful specifically to promote religious freedom as a key human right. In Charter 08's words, we must guarantee freedom of religion and belief and institute a separation of religion and state. There must be no governmental interference in peaceful religious activities. We should abolish any laws, regulations, or local rules that limit or suppress the religious freedom of citizens. We should abolish the current system that requires religious groups and their places of worship to obtain official approval in advance and substitute for it a system in which registry is optional and for those who choose to register, automatic. China's constitution, to be sure, guarantees religious freedom, but only for, in its words, normal religious activity, which the regime confines to the country's 5 officially recognized religious institutions. In its 2012 annual report, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom, a bipartisan institution created by Congress as an adjunct to both the legislative and executive branches, found that China met its criteria as a country of particular concern because, in the Commission's words, the Chinese government continues to violate severely its international obligations to protect freedom of thought, conscience, and religion or belief. And then it goes on to explain why. And I won't go into detail except to note that in China, if you're not part of one of those 5 officially recognized organizations, you are guilty of the crime of illegal religious activity. There are severe strictures for that. Thousands of prisoners of conscience in China are in part or in whole prisoners of religious conscience. You will all have read about the fate of Tibetan Buddhists, perhaps of Uyghur Muslims in Western China, the severe repression of those groups, as well as of Falun Gong and many species of Christians, house churches, etc., makes China one of the most pervasive violators of religious freedom on earth. Hundreds of millions of Chinese nevertheless manifest their beliefs openly and in secret. As in the old Czechoslovakia, China's accession to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to the United Nations Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and on Social, Economic, and Cultural Rights, and to the 1993 Vienna Declaration and Program of Action means almost nothing. Those are the basic instruments of the international human rights law that's pertinent to freedom of religion, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, etc. The authors of Charter 08, like those of Charter 77, offered assertions of these international rights precisely in an environment that cannot meaningfully recognize them, let alone grant or enforce them. Let us look briefly at the case then of communist-era Czechoslovakia, where, as I say, I spent 6 years on foreign service assignment. The Czechoslovak constitution of that era also nominally guaranteed religious freedom, but did so effectively only in the context of the leadership of the working class, which of course meant democratic centralism and the iron hand of the Communist Party's inner leadership. During the 1970s and the 1980s, independent religious leaders like Father Václav Mali, organizers of banned religious pilgrimages, pastors at Baptist and other foreign communities, and of course human rights advocates generally, suffered forced labor, physical violence, employment and educational discrimination, imprisonment, and other horrors. The Charter 77 document itself complained that freedom of religious confession is continually curtailed by arbitrary official action, by interference with the activity of churchmen who are constantly threatened by the refusal of the state to permit them to exercise their functions, or by the withdrawal of such permission by financial and other transactions against those who express their religious faith in word and in action, by constraints on religious training and other means. The pattern which emerged among the Czechoslovak Chartists and their oppressors brought to the fore some basic characteristics of the relationship between rights advocates and authoritarianism. And the reason I use this historical example, and later we'll speak briefly about Russia, is because I think almost all authoritarian regimes show these characteristics. One, authoritarian governments demand that religious communities, cultural organizations, and civil societies obtain official recognition and submit to official control or dissolve. In the cases of communist regimes, this takes the form of their being wrapped into a national front, as in the case of the old Czechoslovakia, or into a pre-existent paradigm of acceptable entities such as China's small list of official religions. In all authoritarian countries, systems of registration exist primarily for the purpose of banning. Two, authoritarian regimes in their approaches to religion drive it into the arms of democratic opposition. This is, from their own perspective, self-defeating, but it is also more or less inevitable. Charter 77 combined a Christian wing with secular reform and cultural wings. Many Chinese religious freedom advocates are also advocates of democracy and human rights. Three, whatever limited liberalizations authoritarian regimes may undertake, the fact remains that they cannot remain authoritarian and at the same time share control of or influence over public opinion with religious communities and civil society. Regimes employ the stick of repression and the carrots of material betterment as tools for maintaining their monopolies of power. Contemporary authoritarian China and the former communist Czechoslovakia shared other characteristics as well. One, the regimes cannot function without corruption. This is true not only because they cannot count on stable popular support and must buy the loyalty of elites and cadres, it arises also because authoritarianism, even in the presence of market reforms such as China's, inevitably produces corruption, and then selectively leaves in place those manifestations of it which usefully buy loyalty while cracking down only on those that do not. Chinese banks ever self-replacing massive on and off book emissions of credit to corrupt state industries are part of this pattern. So was the selective prosecution of Bo Xilai in Liaoning province in 2012. 2. Economic reform on its own cannot produce meaningful democracy or rule of law. It was not true that Czechoslovakia's mild imitation of Gorbachev's perestroika significantly diluted authoritarianism. Although accomplished sinologists, like Vincent, can more effectively speak to the issue, I, for one, do not believe that the economic reforms of the past 3 decades in any real way inevitably foreordain progress in rights or rule of law. The open question is rather whether they foreordain a complete discontinuity of rule. So to expand briefly the field of analysis of authoritarian states looking at Russia. The 1993 Russian Constitution, adopted under Boris Yeltsin, specifies in its Article 28 that everyone shall be granted the right of freedom of conscience, to freedom of religious worship, including the right to profess individually or jointly with others any religion, or to profess no religion, to freely choose, possess, or disseminate religious beliefs and other beliefs, and to act in conformity with them. While there is evidence in the 1990s that the country might actually have been moving in the direction of realizing those still aspirational rights, Russia has now moved systematically and decisively against them. And again, in the interest of time, I won't go into detail, but as Russia has become more authoritarian in the last decade, it has turned a more repressive hand toward the regulation of religion. The 2002 Russian law on extremism, adopted initially partly on the basis of 9/11 and the international interest, in the case of Russia, cover for going after certain objectionable Muslims, has broadened into a very systematic and ardently applied set of strictures against non-traditional religions, against extremist Seventh-day Adventists, extremist Jehovah's Witnesses, extremist Adventists, extremist Baptists, and extremist almost anything. As we cast about for examples of authoritarian repression, then in the case of Russia, what we're looking at is the authoritarianism without the democratic centralism, but I believe the democratic centralism was not the point. It is the authoritarianism that makes it apply. If we are looking for instruments, and should we actually wish any, for improving rule of law and the state of religious freedom in authoritarian states, we should not forget that in the cases of the old Czechoslovakia and of the Soviet Union, we actually thought we had some. The actions of the international community in the context of what was called the Helsinki process, or the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, proved, in my estimation, unprecedentedly effective and may have offered modern history's only important example of the use of international engagement and systematic international leverage on behalf of measured change that ultimately became quantum change. One other possible example was the case of apartheid-era South Africa, whose grievous human rights violations were of a different sort. As the Soviet Union sought security guarantees, arms control agreements, recognition of its influence in its sphere of influence in the Warsaw Pact, the West made clear that it would require that those advantages be purchased in the coin of human rights and of improved economic and trade relations. And that resulted in limited improvements in immigration, in limited numbers of releases of political prisoners. The Soviets wanted something, we demanded a quid pro quo. The regime changes that followed in 1989 to 1991 throughout the Soviet world were all undertaken with their protagonist's specific reference to CSCE and the limited reforms it nurtured, and I, for one, deeply regret the extent to which policymakers and some in academia seem to have forgotten that important record. The fates of Liu Xia and of Liu Xiaobo, like their brilliant and brave accomplishments, inevitably turn our minds toward the quest for freeing them. In what I have said tonight, I offer for consideration the view that that won't come easily. It is the very nature of authoritarianism, however wealthy, to resist. We have recent historic experience in CSCE of marshaling leverage intelligently toward that goal, but China is unlikely, I would submit, to develop a meaningful rule of law culture for believers or for secular rights advocates under its current system of government. The practical point of their inspiring examples and of Liu Xia's evocative art is that persevering in the face of authoritarian injustice in the context of concerted outside engagement can set the stage for optimistic change if the international community engages broadly with concentrated leverage on behalf of it. This thought points toward the suggestion, often tendered by students of human rights and international affairs, that an Asian CSCE might best undergird more thoroughgoing change in China, which may ultimately mean change in the very nature of the regime. And I would be happy to discuss that idea during the question and answer period. Thank you.
The main advantage of going last is that all the important things and interesting things have been said. So I'm afraid that I may not have too much to contribute. But I want to say that I am touched by the work that you're about to see at 3 levels. The art, the love, and the courage. And I was really proud to be a part of this enterprise, as Guy and Richard and Adi have said. Ambassador Bell was a very key, important promoter. Shane and Stephen and Chris. So I was just a little academic who wanted to be a part of this, enterprise. I'm really glad that this can take place at my university. I think, when I first went to see these photographs at Columbia University last April, because it was not curated, as A.D. said, that neither he or A.D. could interpret these photographs better than the photographs themselves, I just let the pictures spoke to me directly. And I was very touched, and because I'm of Chinese heritage, I can understand that the dolls, these are usually children's toys. They symbolize the people. The people are like little children, or even worse, children's toys under an almighty authoritarian state. And you see a lot of pictures of these dolls in various contorted forms, and in cages, in bottles, and so on. Of course, they represent different forms of repression. And you also see a few images of the dolls being in front of a wall with Chinese characters, although these Chinese characters are in an ancient form that many of you may not recognize. And this, of course, refers to an old custom called 人字狱, or a jail for I think Guy actually mentioned that somebody could die for saying words. Yes, they could die. They could die for saying certain words or have some subversive ideas. So I can relate to that. I could also relate to that because Liu Xia is very close to me in age. Well, that probably give away how old I am, but that's okay. So we have probably similar experience in terms of our generational outlook. And to me, the untrained eyes, Liu Xia and Liu Xiaobo, seem like a perfectly ordinary couple. They're very much in love. In fact, that they are probably more in love than many of us can realize. For instance, although Liu Xia was already a very accomplished artist and poet on her own, she was not particularly political. But when her husband, well, her future husband, Liu Xiaobo, was incarcerated in 1996, this woman, this very small, petite woman, asked permission from the prison authorities to marry this man in the prison. I think I don't know how many women would do that, but this is a true sign of love. And her reason was that if I become his wife, then I will have the legal right to visit him, my husband. This is guaranteed under the Chinese Constitution, although at least once a month. That's indomitable love. That's basically a combination of love and courage. So I was very moved by that as well, just at a personal level. Now, I'm a political scientist, so I should wear the hat of a sort of an analyst as well. Ambassador Bill had laid out very beautifully the nature of the authoritarian regime. What additional I can say is, in this case, it really lived up to the saying that what is personal is actually political. Of course, in China, you have the legacy of totalitarianism. China during the Maoist era was a totalitarian state. A totalitarian state basically needed to penetrate the entire society because it needed to transform the society. So the only way they could transform the society, social transformation, was to penetrate the society entirely. Therefore, there was really no separation between what is public and what is private. What is private, in fact, is very public, and vice versa. And you also had this rule firmly established by Mao in 1942, when the communist forces were in their guerrilla bases in Yan'an, today's northwest China, that that culture and art should serve politics, or should serve the party, or should serve the people. But because the party is actually the vanguard of the people, therefore it follows that art and literature should serve the people's agenda. Take the Chinese Constitution, for example. Ambassador Dale already mentioned that on the face of it, it seems to guarantee all kinds of rights and freedoms, including freedom of expression, freedom of religion, and so on, that you otherwise may find in many typical Western liberal constitutions, with a few important caveats. So let me just give you one example. A lot of people ask, how is it possible for China to have a splendid constitution with all these impressive lists of rights and freedoms, yet people vanish in jail, or even worse, as the two commentators already mentioned, that today's Liu Xia has not been charged for any crime. She is a prisoner in her own apartment. And AD also correctly pointed out that she is even worse than a prisoner because she doesn't have the right of a prisoner. So how is that possible? Well, it's actually very simple. Let me break it down for you. There's a syllogism, okay? The Chinese Constitution use the word 人民 very deliberately. 人民means people, but it's actually not a very good exact translation. This is actually a socialist definition of people. So the Constitution says people have the right to do this and do that, or the freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, etc. And then the party constitution also says the Chinese Communist Party is the vanguard party of the people. In other words, only the Chinese Communist Party is the best decider or the interpreter of what is good for the people, nobody else. If anyone is not carrying out the party's agenda, oppose the party, or if it's even perceived to be opposing the party, obviously is opposed to the people, because the party represents the people, right? Therefore, this person is no longer part of the people. 人民 has lost the membership in this definition of the people. Because all the rights and freedoms in the Constitution are only guaranteed for the people. So if someone has lost membership in the people, the 人民, then none of those rights or freedoms will be applicable to this person. And in fact, they could be dealt with very harshly. This can explain, by the syllogism, why there is such a wide gap between the Constitution and the lack of enforcement of constitutional rights. China is a far way away from a nation of rule of law, but the leadership currently is emphasizing rule by law. Law can be very efficient in dealing with your enemies. Now, China is no longer a totalitarian state because after Mao, the totalitarian experiment ended in disaster. So a lot of analysts describe today's China as an authoritarian state. Well, this is obviously a totalitarian retreat. So today's Chinese government neither penetrates the society nor seeks social transformation. So this is a huge difference from Mao's time. Mao wants to penetrate the society and also transform the society. Today's Chinese regime seeks neither. But they are very interested in self-preservation. So by nature, they are very conservative. And so how do they ensure their self-preservation? First, they try to co-opt those people, organizations that have the shared interest with the current regime or the direction the regime is taking, or at least will benefit from supporting the regime's course of action. This can explain why the so-called capitalists or academics are doing some academics are doing quite well today in China. Well, you would think that the academics naturally should be very critical. Sometimes they are the thorn in the eye to the regime. But today's many Chinese academics actually benefit from the government's largesse. So they are actually pro-government. I'm not saying everyone, but a lot of academics are doing quite well in China compared to Mao's time. Okay? This also includes by playing on the popular fear, or maybe I should call it risk aversion, that if you push too hard on the regime, that you could lose all the quote-unquote unprecedented freedoms that you have. Today, there's no doubt today's ordinary citizens in China enjoy a lot more freedoms and rights than before. They are, for the most part, they are free to move, they are free to study whatever they like, they are free to choose their occupations, they are even free to converse in politics or even criticize the party as long as they do it in private and they do not go on record. Right? They do not organize party, and they do not form other political, overt political activities. So, and they have the freedom to make money, a lot of money. In fact, the regime seems to think that this is maybe a very good venue for the Chinese energetic and enthusiastic entrepreneurial Chinese people to really put their energy where the energy is. As long as they are busy with making money, they will probably refrain from engaging in political activities, which is just fine with the regime. This is what is the so-called the new social compact after the 1989 Tiananmen crackdown. And most people are fine with it. In fact, when they perceive there are some quote-unquote ungrateful troublemakers, namely those people who signed the Charter of 08, or try to organize political parties, or try to really make good on those rights guaranteed under the Chinese Constitution, that many Chinese people, even the very well-educated or affluent Chinese people living in large cities like Beijing or Shanghai, where the per capita income is already over $10,000. In other words, most political scientists would consider that a country reaching this zone should have already begun democratic transition. But the reason why it hasn't happened in China is that these people, the so-called middle class, the nouveau riche and so on, are actually conservative. They are not a progressive force. This is in contrast to the Western experience, because the Western scholars, like Benjamin Moore, who studied the democracy in 6 European countries, the Western experience has always been that the middle class is a progressive force. Hence, the saying, no middle class, no democracy. No bourgeoisie, no democracy. When the middle class acquire assets and so on, and wealth, they want to preserve it. Therefore, they fight for political rights. That's why they are a progressive force. But in China, the nouveau riche, the new middle class, are actually conservative. They are not very sympathetic to people like Liu Xia and so on, whom in the West might consider just exercising their fundamental rights. So, and in fact, many Chinese people are afraid that if people like Liu Xiaobo and others push too hard, the regime might actually crack down, and therefore taking away the assortment of unprecedented opportunities from them. So they are actually not sympathetic at all. This is why I'm actually a little bit skeptical that the mere increase in living standard or expansion of education or the rise of the middle class in China alone will lead to democracy. I think it will take a critical factor, which is the determination at the top level. But that's another side of the story. And one final pillar of this authoritarian strategy is actually to, well, first of all, they have buy off some of the traditional elements that could cause trouble for the regime, such as the capitalists or the academics. And they have played on the popular fear that don't push too hard because otherwise you might lose what you have. And so they basically, have gotten maybe 95 or 98% of population with them. And then they deal harshly with those troublemakers, such as Liu Xiaobo or the party organizers and so on. And I should also mention that in this authoritarian enterprise, due to the conservative nature and the bureaucratic inertia of the regime, it's much easier to put someone on the blacklist than to take him off. Because once a person is put on the blacklist, it will basically require the reversal of a decision made by a powerful person, and that person might still be alive. This is why it is so difficult to reverse the 1989 verdict, because the Communist Party had defined that as a counter-revolutionary act, which is actually a very serious allegation in the socialist jargon. Okay? And this is because some of the people who were involved, well, Deng Xiaoping is no longer alive, but some of the people who were involved directly or indirectly with the 1989 decision are still alive. And this is why it's also easy to explain why the Deng Xiaoping could gain a rehabilitation only after Mao died, because Mao made a lot of the decisions relating to Cultural Revolution and so on. So it was impossible to reverse those decisions when Mao was still alive. So it might take a few more years for some of the fundamental decisions in China to be reversed, including I was last told that the current the presumptive General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, Xi Jinping, is thinking about releasing Liu Xia. After all, Liu Xia has broken no law and so on, but he faces opposition from his peers. Now, the way the Politburo, the apex of the Chinese power structure, is consisting of 7 men. Well, so far there's no women, but you get the idea. That these 7 people basically balance one another. So even if Xi is in favor of releasing Liu Xia, it will be any one of the remaining 6 can veto his decision. So the point I'm making here is it's a lot easier to put someone on the blacklist than taking him off. And as long as there's no overwhelming reason to remove someone from that blacklist, that person will stay on the blacklist forever or for a long time. That's the authoritarian nature of the regime. And finally, authoritarian regime, in this case, I think it's a case of a guilt by association. Liu Xia is not a criminal and has not been found of any crime, even under the Chinese laws, but she is under house arrest, as we already know, and deprived of most of her fundamental rights. This is because the regime cannot afford to take the risk of allowing even popular doubt of the party's decisions. In this sense, her only crime is that she is Liu Xiaobo's wife. Because the regime sees Liu Xiaobo as a threat, therefore it sees people who are closely associated with him, such as Liu Xia or their close friends, as lesser, but nonetheless real threats. Art should be art, as the people always say. But against the above background I just analyzed for you, it is hard not to separate. It is almost impossible to separate or disregard the political context from the art. In terms of motivations, some of the commentators already mentioned that in totalitarian or authoritarian states, art or literature often becomes a medium for political expression or political dissent. For example, the 1984 or the Master and Margarita in the former Soviet Union. A.D. Coleman had already eloquently stated this point. And Sorman also mentioned that art and literature should represent the people, right? There's another side of this, the real China. And in terms of the consequences, art cannot be separated from politics, because if the wrong kind of art or literature are allowed, it might sow the seeds of popular perception, understanding, empathy, or doubt of the party. Therefore, it will actually weaken the party's legitimacy or rule. The regime, the Chinese regime, it's not correct that the Chinese government is not interested in promoting art. Quite the contrary, the Chinese government in recent years have emphasized the promotion of soft power. China's rise will be a different kind of peace-loving power. It will be totally different from all the traditional Western paths. China will be a peace-loving country, and will be based on grand civilization, and China is has world-class artists and so on. But the key difference here is that the Chinese government is interested in only promoting certain forms of art, namely politically correct art. This can explain why the famous director Zhang Yimou was heavily promoted by the government. Not only that Zhang Yimou produced some world-class movies, many of them the libraries MRC possessed, but also Zhang Yimou was favored by the government to choreograph the opening ceremony of the 2008 Olympics, because to the Chinese government, the 2008 was a coming out moment. Right? So they need to have a politically correct artist to do that job. This can also explain why the Chinese government was so happy when Mo Yan received last year's Nobel Literature Prize, but the Chinese government was totally stone cold to Gao Xinqiang, who was another Chinese writer who received a Nobel Literature Prize. So the same prize, Literature Prize, why two different reactions? Because Mo Yan is promoted by the government. Therefore, my point is that if the government sees art as politics, namely the international acceptance of artists promoted by the government as essentially affirmation of the regime, then therefore it is not possible for us to separate the political context from art. I think I've said enough. That I hope that you will see this exhibit through your personal encounter or through your analytical mind. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for just a couple of questions. Vincent told me to be a stern gatekeeper. So,
Yeah, and I make a very, very short comment.
absolutely.
Because listening to all these interventions certainly came back to my mind when the numerous conversations I had in Beijing with Liu Xia and Liu Xia when they were still free. And one constant question from Liu Xia and even more from Liu Xia was, how come that you, Western intellectuals, do not support us as you did in the case of the Soviet Union? Mm-hmm. And this comes back to your position. And they could not understand, why don't you support us? And my answer, I don't know if my answer was right, but the answer I always gave was, because of course, in the West, I mean, there is a fear that the business relationship with China will be disrupted. This is the common explanation, okay? I have another one, which I think is deeper, that in the Western mind, there is this notion that the Chinese are not like us, they don't know what freedom is about. It is a nation which has always been governed from the top by an emperor, and the current regime is just a continuation of what the Chinese always had. So I think, I'm deeply convinced that the reason why, and I can see that when I appeal to my own government to support Chinese Democrats, and the French government and many other governments, the Chinese like it. I mean, they don't impose democracy to the Chinese, don't impose freedom to the Chinese, which is based, of course, on total ignorance of Chinese history and total ignorance of Chinese Taoist religion or Buddhist religion. But I think that we have, of course, tonight is the exception in a way, because we have bringing support to these people, but mostly I think the fight, for me, is a fight within the Western world. We have to know more about the Chinese civilization and to understand that the Chinese are just like us, and that we should support them as we support freedom fighters in South Africa, in Burma, in Russia, and other countries. They are not different, they are human beings, they are our brothers and sisters. And this is what I said to Liu Xia and Liu Xia. I nearly forgot this anecdote, but you know what, listening to this conversation and this debate, all this just suddenly came back to my mind.
Just one very quick comment. You're absolutely right. And one of the differences is, of course, Russia and the Warsaw Pact were geographically closer, but there were these organizations. There's the European Union, there's NATO, and all the other alphabet soup of Europe. And that is one functional difference. That's why I mentioned the need to create those structures in Asia. You have ASEAN, which only last year had or declared a human rights charter highly deficient. So there is the need for greater regional integration before you can get to that. That's a structural difference.
Can we take a question from the audience?
How do you see the explosion of the internet affecting cultural change in China now?
I would say that the conventional view is that internet is a agent of change, progressive democratic change. But don't forget, the communist government is the master of controlling information, and historically they have harnessed the various technology to serve the purpose of the party. The internet is no exception. They can route all the traffic through certain nodes, and they can employ 150,000 internet police to closely monitor what's being discussed on the discussion board and so on. So I think that the internet, but on the other hand, they also need the internet in order to access the Western ideas and technology and so on, because internet embodies globalization. So the Chinese government is basically continuing this century-old quest of trying to get the best from the West while fending off its worst. So they see basically the democracy, human rights, and so on as subversive, but they want the Western technology. Their approach about the internet is exactly the same.
Oh, got one more question.
Well, I just had a question. I just came back from the Hirshhorn and saw the Ai Weiwei exhibition. And he seems to be a perfect example of somebody that was supported by the state. I mean, the Bird's Nest Stadium was designed by him. And he's currently under house arrest. And certainly there was international attention to that, and artists coming together to try to get his release and work for his release. So could you talk a little bit about, I mean, that's a very contemporary example of what you're all talking about in terms of artists, politics, international attention.
I'll take a small chunk of that. And he is their nightmare, I would say, because he's prominent enough, unlike Liu Xia, right, who is unknown here,
Yes.
basically, as an artist, right? Unknown in the West. She hasn't exhibited before. He became prominent enough that he has a kind of almost independent power that anything they do to him is going to be highly, highly visible.
Sure.
Right? And he's also, and I don't mean this in any derogatory sense toward Liu Xia, he's a very astute manipulator of the internet, the international media, etc. So if they put webcams, surveillance cams outside his house, he brings the inside of his house to the webcams and broadcasts everything he's doing on the internet until they close those down, right? I mean, he knows how to game the system in a way that Liu Xia, who simply does not, or does not care to, or does not know how to do, right? So, he's their worst nightmare, right? Is a guy who knows how to play the system, has enough power that they can't banish him, they can't disappear him, they can trump up some charges of tax evasion and so forth, and try to make him, criminalize him in the minds of the Chinese, but no one in the West is buying that, and they can't really silence him easily. I mean, I suppose they can have him shot in the night in some way, but there will be international repercussions, which goes very much, I think, to what the ambassador was talking about, that there's enough vigilance in relation to him and some other figures in the Chinese art and creative world, that those figures are protected by their prominence and by their recognition from the West that eyes are on them. And part of the goal of this particular project has been to turn that spotlight on Liu Xia. Because the more attention that is brought to her and her work as an artist, not simply her as the wife of Liu Xia, but her as an independent artist and an independent thinker, the more attention that is brought to her, the more the world's attention is brought to her, the harder it is for the Chinese regime to do her harm invisibly.
Okay, one last word.
I think there are two tracks of thinking about this. One is protection of protagonists. And in the case of Czechoslovakia, there was Václav Havel, whom I saw very frequently, both when he was coming out of prison and when he was about to go back. But we didn't worry about Havel going to prison because all the world would know what the conditions were of his imprisonment. What we worried about was the lesser figures. And it's very hard for people, be they journalists or diplomats or governments, to calibrate just exactly what kind of attention for the lesser figures will actually protect them and what kind will render them more at risk. But the other aspect of this is engagement on behalf of change in authoritarian states, which is, after all, why Liu Xia, and many, many other people in many authoritarian states do what they do. They are sincere in their desire to change the system and not naive about it. And they know that what they do will have no effect, will in fact have been wasted unless the outer world engages seriously, concertedly, and hard-headedly on their behalf. So that engagement, either helps them to succeed or trashes the sacrifice. Would you agree with that?
I would agree. And I think that's also what Guy was saying before in the question that they were asking, that they need that attention. And do you put them in some way further at risk by bringing them that attention, which is unwelcome by the government? Well, yes, you have to weigh that. And I weigh that, my wife Anne weighed that, and you weigh that. All of us who've been involved in these projects weigh that. Which is the more protective of them. And I come down, I think we've all come down on the side of turn the spotlight on someone like this. Liu Xia does not need the spotlight turned on him. Liu Xia needs the spotlight turned on her. As you can see from that video, see if you go online and look at the recent videos of her that were made without authorization in December of this past year. She's having a very, very hard time. I think he's prepared to spend 11 years in prison. I'm not sure she's prepared to spend 11 years in her apartment. And that does not speak to any cowardice or any moral failure on her part.
But if I may, because this is a very important point, we discussed that before. Anything we do is with their agreement. Okay? And we wouldn't show the Liu Xia's photos if she wouldn't agree. We don't want to put her at risk, so we always balance, what's good, what's bad, is it dangerous, and they know best. So it is ultimately their decision.
Yeah. And if we would come down from them, the show has to end, and the website has to come down and all that, we would do that.